So I'm going to talk about the evolution of piano technique with the focus on the relationship between Romanticism and Minimalism. To understand the relationship between the two periods of music, I will first explain the social context behind each period and how that affected the composer's writing style and the overall style of the periods. So, beginning with the Romantic period, the overall style of music could be described as being full of expression. There was a deep concern for the metaphysical problems of existence, death, and eternity. Therefore, those from the period began to praise imagination over reason, emotions over logic. So Romanticism can be characterized by its exoticism, nationalism, individualism, and interest in the supernatural, along with using nature as inspiration, which was also prevalent in Romantic art. In addition to the characteristics of Romantic music, there was an expansion of musical forms and harmonic vocabulary. Chromaticism was employed more often, and there was a greater range of tone color and more changes in dynamics. There was a new emphasis on small personal works, such as art songs and short piano works, and existing forms such as symphonies and sonatas increased in length. Lastly, the increased emphasis on instrumental virtuosity was made possible by technical improvements in the instruments, such as the piano's increase in pitch range. So now I'm going to talk about how society at the time caused these changes to occur. The impact of the French Revolution set the stage for free thinkers and allowed artists to begin to express themselves more freely. It was essentially a revolt against the established order of the classical period. The Industrial Revolution also had an impact on the music of the time. The growth of industrial jobs created a rise in the middle class, and the middle class then began to gain more education, which resulted in them learning the piano. Also within the classical period, many composers were hired to write religious works for churches, and the churches then lost influence of the types of music that the composers could create, so secular music became more popular and sparked the beginning of subscription concerts. So now that I covered the background to the Romantic period, I will begin my discussion of piano technique by focusing on Franz Liszt. Liszt was the ultimate virtuoso pianist and popularized piano performance with his impressive showmanship. Not only was he one of the first to tour as a concert pianist across Europe, but he also shocked audiences by appearing alone on stage instead of sharing the concert with musicians as what was expected. His influence on the period continued, with the position of the piano now being oriented to see the performer's profile. And he also opened the lid to better project the sound. In addition, he would perform from memory, which hadn't been done before, and his unique performances would attract huge crowds and resulted in fans ripping at his clothes and hair, and the phenomenon came to be known as Lisztomania. So now that I covered the background of Liszt's life, I will talk about his influence on piano technique. Liszt was a teacher to over 400 students throughout his lifetime with the influence of his master classes. In these classes, the number of students ranged from 4 to 40, and he didn't charge for these lessons. And students were instructed to practice about 6 or 7 hours each day, yet focus on the motion or character of a piece over the technique. So that isn't to say that he didn't care about the technique, but his philosophy of teaching was the notion of competition. He believed that playing to other students in these large classes resulted in the students becoming more motivated. He also placed emphasis on the quality of sound and interpretation. This quality of sound could be created, according to him, through visualizing the kind of sound that they wanted to hear before they played it, or only picture the image and the body would find its own way to project it. So in conclusion to Liszt's piano technique, his virtuosity was an important part of his piano performance. Initially, Liszt was inspired by Niccolo Paganini, who was a virtuosic violinist, but eventually he came to create his own virtuosic style. The style resulted in the easiness and lucidity of playing, which could be achieved through his relationship of the mind, which I previously mentioned. So emphasis was not on the fingers, but the control the mind had over the physical execution and technical development in piano performance. So it was no longer about finding the proper technique, but connecting the mind to the musical expression and staying calm in technically challenging situations. So now I'm going to focus on another very influential composer, Frédéric Chopin. Chopin was primarily a composer of piano music and character pieces. So character pieces were basically the staple of the Romantic period. It focused on a main idea to evoke a certain emotion. Chopin, for example, wrote many mazurkas and polonaises, which were influenced by Polish dance and the nation as a whole. He didn't enjoy performing in front of crowds and actually believed that concerts took away from the emotion of the music. So he only performed 30 public performances, which would be about 1 or 2 per year after he moved to Paris. So since he didn't like large performances, he was better suited for the intimate environment of the salon, which were small private gatherings in the homes of the upper class. So now I'll move on to the discussion of his influence on piano technique. Chopin was one of the first composers to work extensively on the newly constructed and updated piano of the time, so his influence on the Romantic technique was substantial. He developed a new dependence on the pedal and frequently wrote elaborations over a bass note, since the bass note could not be held with the pedal without it dying away too quickly. He also enjoyed playing 2 notes against 3, which required extreme independence of the hands and a lot of ornamentation. This ornamentation was inspired by bel canto singers, and Liszt described it as small groups of grace notes falling like tiny drops of speckled dew over the melodic figure. In addition to those innovations, Chopin disagreed with the belief of the previous period that finger articulation was best supported by the wrist. Chopin relied upon his whole arm and minimal tension. So the lightest touch should be the lightest touch should be used. He suggested having the elbows level with the body and keeping them relaxed and close, close. He also was considered a virtuoso pianist due to the new image of being able to play difficult passages with ease and musicality. Chopin didn't build his technique from simply practicing exercises, but focusing on the sound production. His philosophy of teaching was focused on the idea of music as a language. So now I will focus on a specific piece by Chopin entitled Berceuse. This is a short character piece that was written as a lullaby. It is an example of his talent in constructing variations over a simple bass line. The harmony is one modulation repeated throughout, and the melody constantly moves to resemble rocking cradles. Upon reaching the end, the piece returns back to the simple melody from which it begins. So the piece is very lyrical and features chromatic harmonies throughout, and employs the use of rubato, which Chopin is known for using. So now I will play it for you to hear all the romantic elements. Thanks. So, okay, now I'm going to talk about a form of music known as minimalism. Minimalism began around 1960, but it never truly died in the sense of the word. Minimalism can actually mean different things. There was a period in time in which composers such as Steve Reich and Philip Glass created unique but simplistic pieces that returned back to the idea of being created for a purpose. So when I refer to minimalism in this presentation, I'm referring more to the idea that a specific piece is very minimal in its use of dynamics or shifts in its musical ideas. So minimalism is a form of art music, which is essentially music that descended from traditional Western classical music. It is related to other styles of music such as experimental music, serialism, and avant-garde. Prominent features of minimalism include consonant harmony and a steady pulse. As with Romanticism, minimalism was affected by the events occurring during the time period and the style of music that came before it. It came into existence through post-Romanticism, leading into Impressionism, and with Impressionism came Modernism, Neoclassicism, Expressionism, and later Minimalism. Minimalism was essentially a revolt against Expressionism, Serialism, and Determinism. With the group of composers studying under Arnold Schoenberg, they created the Second Viennese School. Within the Second Viennese School, they created a kind of music that came to be known as atonal. So when composers such as Steve Reich came along, they wanted to abandon everything that was created under and influenced by Schoenberg. The music was said to be complicated due to the use of 12-tone technique and serialism, so minimalism was a return to just creating music to be enjoyed. So now I'm going to review the similarities and differences that I've covered so far between the periods. Romanticism was a period of connecting to emotions after dealing with the strict rules of the Baroque and Classical periods. Just like minimalism was a connection to serious music again after Expressionism and Serialism. Also, Romanticism was brought about by the dwindling influence of the church on composers' writing, whereas minimalism was focusing on ending the popularity of attempting to create complex music. So now that I covered some of the similarities and differences between the two periods, I'm going to focus on two minimalist composers. First is Ludovico Einaudi, who began his career as a classical composer and a composer of film scores. In addition to being a pianist, he also plays the guitar and did his musical training at a conservatory in Milan. While there, he was influenced by African vocal music and the Beatles. So Einaudi's music drew from contemporary pop, yet it was considered ambient and meditative. Although he was classically trained, he said that the allure of popular music destroyed any urge to linger in the wastelands of atonalism. He also stated that he couldn't find a way to write music with numbers and rules, so he tried to forget the academic idea of music and focus on creative work. Also, when asked about his technique, he said that he had a lot of technical difficulties and a very strict teacher. His advice on the subject was to find a teacher that helps you find yourself, not someone that's imposing a technique. And that leads into another minimalist composer, Fabrizio Paterlini. Paderlini is a contemporary classical music composer that is not only a pianist, but he owns his own record label, Fabrizio Paderlini Records. He began his musical career after his schooling by performing rock classics, pop, and jazz in local bands. While playing various gigs, he began composing as well. Influenced by his hometown of Mantua, Italy, he then created many elegant and cinematic pieces. So his approach to minimalism is considered neoclassical, but also ambient, emotive, dreaming, and passionate. He creates music by focusing on the experiences he creates daily and living in the present. He says that the process of composition rarely starts with melodies, but rather begins with a certain attitude. Lastly, like Liszt, Paderlini visualizes the pieces he plays, and he becomes part of the piece. An example of Paderlini's minimalist style is his piece, My Piano the Clouds. In this piece, you will find a lack of strict dynamic markings and a steady pulse. It also has a simplistic theme, which is typical of minimalism, so there's room for freedom of interpretation. So before I play the piece, I'm going to go over the stylistic similarities between Romanticism and minimalism. The Romantic period had an extreme focus on emotion, as did minimalism, which focused on feeling over the strict rules of music theory. In addition, both periods didn't have a main focus on actual piano technique, but rather on sound production or feeling. Lastly, both periods thought of music as a language after the strict rules of their previous periods. So in conclusion, between the two pieces I described, Berceuse was a character piece which featured flowing melodies, rubato, and emphasis on touch. My Piano the Clouds, on the other hand, is an art song with a simplistic melody, yet like Berceuse, has flowing phrases. There's also an emphasis on emotion. So now I will play the piece so you can hear the minimalistic characteristics. Forgot to lift this.